My name is Bob Summersgill. I'm the president of the board of the Robert F. Kennedy Children's Action Corps, and I am here to thank all of you for being here. And also, I would like to recognize we've got a number of our staff from the Action Corps, and I'd like to just recognize them and give them a round of applause, because these are the people who are really on the front lines of dealing with some of the issues that our distinguished panel is going to be talking about tonight. It's an honor for us to be here, to be part of this forum this evening. And in a minute, Julie Wilson from the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy will introduce our panel. I'd like to take just a moment, however, to tell you a little bit about our agency, the RFK Children's Action Corps. We're approaching our 30th anniversary. We were founded shortly after the assassination of Bobby Kennedy by a group of concerned people here in the Boston area who wanted to establish a living memorial to Bobby Kennedy and the work that he had done for and on behalf of children. We have been at it now really working for disadvantaged children, and we feel that we've compiled a pretty good record over the years. And I think that as we hear the discussion that's about to take place tonight, we can reflect on some of the challenges, really, that we who are in this area of work are facing. It's not an easy task out there, and one of the key components of our work, in addition to working with these children in the residential facilities that we operate around the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, is to be advocates for these children, for these less fortunate children in our society. And tonight's event is part of that advocacy. So thank you once again for being here. Julie?
Thank you very much, and I too would like to welcome you to the ARCO Forum at the Kennedy School of Government, to an event that should be very exciting. This event is sponsored by the Weiner Center and by our Student Professional Interest Council, the Social Policy Professional Interest Council. I'd like to particularly welcome Donald Stern, if you could stand, who is the U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts. Thank you for being here. What I'm going to do is briefly introduce each of the panelists before we begin the discussion, and I want to emphasize each because these are very distinguished people, and we could take up a lot of time talking about them, but we'd rather have more time talking about the issues. And then this group is going to, each person is going to present some ideas and spend a little bit of time discussing with one another, and then we will open it up to questions from you. So let me start with Shea Bilchick, who is the administrator in the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention of the U.S. Department of Justice. He's held this position for 4 years. This is the agency that's responsible for leading the effort to address public safety issues of juvenile crime and youth victimization. Shea is a lawyer with extensive experience in public service as Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Department of Justice and as an Assistant State Attorney in Florida. Commissioner Paul Evans, Commissioner of the Boston Police Department. He has established the goal of fully implementing the philosophy of community or neighborhood policing in Boston, which means that he needs to be very involved in both organizational change in the department and the establishment of new relationships with individuals and organizations in the community. No small task in Boston. The commissioner has been a member of the police force for nearly 30 years. Penny Green, who is Director of Research at the Center for Health Communications at the Harvard School of Public Health. She's what I would refer to as a utility infield faculty member. Basically, you name it, she's taught it at some point at the School of Public Health. Her most recent work was the Harvard MetLife Survey of Youth Violence. Many of you may have seen this covered in the press, and she is going to talk about some of their findings tonight. And finally, David Leaderman, who is Executive Director of the Child Welfare League of America, and he's held this position since 1994. This is the oldest and largest voluntary organization in the United States that's concerned with developing and improving services to abused, neglected, and deprived children. David began his career as a youth worker in Boston public housing. He became a state legislator and served as chief of staff for Governor Michael Dukakis, so he too has had a very long career in public service. What I'd like to do is start with Penny. And Penny, the question I'd like to ask you is the following. We've seen and heard about a number of very serious and very frightening events recently of children shooting their schoolmates, sort of mowing them down with weapons. Is there more violence among youth in our communities? Are some communities more violent than others? What do we know about these youth?
Well, the study we conducted was conducted in the spring of 1997 and was followed, coincidentally, by a string of rural fatal shootings, 6 in particular, that got a lot of attention. So I think that as a result of those shootings where several students and teachers were killed and 50 more were injured, there was an appearance of it being a rural problem. Possibly before that, people thought it might be an urban or inner city problem. And our study found that the amount of youth violence in terms of fighting, and this was among 7th to 12th graders, was pretty much uniform across both urban, suburban, and rural areas, and also was the same among all ethnic groups. There was a slight difference in the two sexes. Boys were more likely to fight than girls, but not, it wasn't entirely boys. And it was about a third of the students had been involved in fights in the previous year. That was just the previous year before we asked the question. And that was, here's the gender difference. About 43% of the boys had been involved in a fight and 21% of the girls. Now, my understanding is that youth homicide itself is down somewhat in the past few years, and perhaps Commissioner Evans can talk about that. But it's down for the past few years, but still higher than it used to be about 10 years ago. And we also found that of those who had not been in, actually in physical fights, almost all of them had witnessed physical fights within the past year as well. And there is an underlying inability to control anger, as discussed and disclosed by these students. They agreed with statements like, when I'm really angry, there is no way I can control myself. Or if I'm challenged, I am going to fight. Percentages like 41% to 30% of the students agreed with those kinds of statements. Basically, an inability to control their anger, and the fights were most often provoked by a verbal, not another physical confrontation. And so I think in part what we might be seeing is that although that 1/3, that 33% seems to have been standard when we compare our results to what the Centers for Disease Control have found over the past several years, we may be seeing more serious outcomes from the fights, possibly because of the use of weapons, and possibly because the fighting itself is more severe with the anger level being more intense.
Okay. So if I were to sort of briefly summarize, there really aren't differences in the level of anger and the propensity to respond in terms of fighting between urban, suburban, and rural youth.
That's correct. Not in those sections there were no differences. There were also no geographical sections, whether it was northwest, southeast, upper plains. It was relatively similar throughout the entire country.
Okay. Shea, I want to turn to you because I think everyone's had some strong and almost visceral reactions to some of the events that we've seen, and very often what happens is the public policy response to this looks at some of the extreme events. Recently, there's been legislation drafted with harsher juvenile justice sanctions, housing youth offenders with adults, holding youth status offenders in adult facilities, and that sort of thing. Is there a sentiment that this is the direction we ought to be going, that it's more cost-effective, more productive? What's the thinking on this?
I think the predominant thinking is still that if you're going to effectively take on the issue of juvenile crime and the increase in juvenile violence, you're going to do that by using a very balanced approach, not one extreme or another. So when you see some of this legislation coming forward, and I think it's a reaction to some of the increasing levels of violence we have seen over the past 10 years, particularly increased levels of gun violence in many communities. You also see taking hold in places like Boston, as well as other communities, of strategizing as to how do we figure out how both to ensure immediate public safety through more aggressive law enforcement and correctional measures, but then also how do we capitalize the knowledge we have now on the good prevention programming that can be put into place for real long-term substantial decreases. So you can do a lot of corrections, you can do a lot of law enforcement focus, and you can decrease crime. But I'm sitting next to a man who can tell you, yeah, but I can get some decreases, but the long-term increases are going to happen if we really invest in prevention. So this discussion that's taking place in communities across the country is one where I think, perhaps fortunately, we have corresponding research now that says we understand better the pathways towards delinquency, we understand better the opportunities to interrupt the cycle of violence that many kids are experiencing, and we can actually identify programs that we can put into place as part of overall strategies that will work to reduce crime. So when you piece that together, like a Boston has, like other communities now are trying to mirror Boston's success, you have hope that it's not just a matter of the extreme of let's just lock them up, let's incarcerate status offenders, that we can really punish our way out of this. That's not the way it can be done. So it's a good time in a way for all this attention and focus, and the fact that it hasn't disappeared because the crime rate's gone down over the past 2 or 3 years. We need to maintain that focus now, build on what we know works, and put it into place in communities. Not just an isolated year or two, but long-term strategic plans within communities. And maybe the Commissioner can talk about this, because I think that's something that communities like Boston are looking towards. How do you institutionalize these good things that have happened over the last couple of years? So it's not just a matter of, is Commissioner Evans in office? Is Mayor Menino there? Do you have a particularly thoughtful school superintendent? But how do you make sure that this community invests at grassroots level up to leadership into long-term strategic planning that will ensure those reductions? And as I said, we're fortunate to understand the problem better. We don't just argue from the gut anymore. It used to be, as a prosecutor, I'd always have to just argue from the gut. It's the right thing to do to invest in kids. It's the right thing to do to have this child go into an early intervention program. I didn't have the research to back that up. But now we do. Now we know it every step along the way. Even some of the recent results that came out in the Journal of American Medicine recently from Dr. David Olds, where he showed that through nurse home visitation programs, we not only could reduce child abuse and neglect, reduce welfare dependency, delay second births, and all the good things that come from that for young teen moms, but we also, 15 years out, will see those infants now as adolescents half as likely to be delinquent in their lives as their counterparts that don't benefit from that kind of program. That's the earliest of prevention. You can take that all the way up into the JJ system, and you'll see programs in the juvenile justice system now that are proven to be effective in reducing crime. That's the good news.
That's a particularly important finding because that was such a well-designed and well-documented study, so that we really do have a sense of what we've learned from that.
And there are more and more of those, not
That are
just in
coming
that
out.
area, but other areas where we have well-designed studies to prove that the effectiveness.
Paul, we can't think of a better introduction for what you're doing.
Well, I think, how did we get where we are today? I think in the late 80s, early 90s, we were dealing with the emergence of crack cocaine and a gang problem. Not only Boston was dealing with that, but certainly the country was dealing with it. And we weren't dealing with it very well. I mean, the traditional police response was, let's get tough, let's crack down, let's make arrest. And in many instances, we were only exacerbating the problem. So I can recall early on, when I became the police commissioner, we had some serious problems, and we went to the officers who were closest to the problems and said to those officers, what do we do to stop the violence? I'd been around, I think, 26 years at the time. I fully expect them to tell me we need more cops, we need tougher judges, and we need more jail space. The best cops in my department were saying, we need jobs and alternatives for young people. These were the people that were out there every day dealing with the problem. And I think that started our comprehensive approach. And there was also a realization that what we were doing wasn't working, that we had to create partnerships, that we had to work with the community, that the police alone weren't going to solve the problem. So that began a comprehensive approach to the whole issues of violence: prevention, intervention, and enforcement. And I have to stress that all of those are equally important. If you don't have them all, I don't think you're going to be successful. When we talk prevention, in Boston, we're lucky we've got the U.S. Attorney, Don Stern, the AG, the DA, myself. We're all out there advocating for jobs for young people. Provide them with alternatives. And we work with the business community to provide alternatives and jobs for people. We work with the clergy. And trying to get as many partners who have a role to play is absolutely critical. And that's the prevention end. On the intervention end, we've had a model program called Operation Nightlight, where police and probation officers visit the homes of high-risk individuals, where we create, instead of curfews for everybody, we identify the kids who are in problems. We have time curfews for them, and we also have area curfews, which in essence takes them right out of the gangs. And finally, enforcement. I think you can't just talk prevention. You have to talk enforcement. And part of it becomes defining the problem. In Boston, with the help of the Kennedy School, we defined the problem. We looked at who was being killed and who was doing the killing in our city. Between 1990 and 1994, we lost 155 young people under the age of 21 were killed in this city. When we looked at those young people, better than two-thirds of them, 117 of them, had been arrested at least once. Of those arrested at least once, the average number of arrests for the young people were 9.7 times. They were no strangers to the criminal justice system. And when we arrested a killer, the average arrest for killers were 9.4 times. So we had a small, disproportionate amount of young people who were committing a disproportionate amount of the violent crime, and they were usually gang involved. So rather than just going out and stereotyping all the young people, we started a program really of focused intervention, police and probation working together, collectively the law enforcement community working together, making sure that we are identifying the people who needed to be removed from the street. And a lot of people coming together, the partnerships. And the end result is, in the late 80s and early 90s, we had a lot of good kids who were carrying guns, and they were carrying guns only for sheer protection. So, what we've seen is a lessening, certainly, of the violence in our city. I think we've seen a 76% reduction in young people under the age of 24 who've been killed in the city, two-thirds fewer assaults with firearms than there were in our worst years of 1990. But I think it's a comprehensive approach. Everybody has a role to play in dealing with this. And, again, where do we go next? I think that's the challenge.
Let me just follow up with one question. I was particularly intrigued with you saying that you don't have a curfew for all youth, but you identify certain youth, and they have a curfew. How do you identify those youth?
I think that's a part of the partnership approach. I mean, a lot of times what we'll do is the police and probation officers will sit down together and look at what are their histories, the high risk that they pose to themselves and the community. One story, very quickly. One of our officers and probation officer goes up to a home. As they're going up, the probationer is scurrying in the back door. The mother meets them at the door. She's got an infant in her arms, and they check on the young person. He's fine. The mother walks the officers out to the door and says to them, "When did you start this program? This is absolutely terrific." Here's a young woman who's trying to keep her kid alive, in essence. He's 16 years old. She's having trouble controlling him, and the police are there with the probation officers supporting her efforts to keep him off the street, keep him in the house, and keep him out of trouble.
And so you get the positive response then from the community. David, Penny started out talking about the distribution of not just violence, but the distribution of anger, and a large number of youth who are angry, and I think in an earlier discussion you were saying who feel that no one has any interest in them and no one cares for them. Where did this anger come from, and what do we know about these children?
Well, let me try to give it some context. I think there's no question that there are angry kids in Lincoln, Mass, and Newton, Mass, and Malden, and then Cambridge and Boston. But I don't think that the folks at the Walpole prison come from Lincoln, Newton, or some of the more affluent communities. I think you really have to look at I want to try to put three things together to give it some context. First, start with poverty as a factor, as I think a critical factor. We have the largest child poverty rate in the industrialized world. We're 21% child poverty rate. The National Incidence Study, which is the National Incidence Study of maltreatment in the United States, tells us that kids who grow up in families with incomes of under $15,000, as opposed to kids who grow up in families with incomes of over $30,000, are 22 times more likely to be maltreated. There's a 22 times ratio between poor kids and more affluent kids. Now, let's give it context again. It's not to say that most poor families don't do a phenomenal job of raising their kids, because they do, because many of us in this room grew up in poor families who did a great job of raising us. So most poor families struggle against the odds, but the odds are, and it gets to something Paul said, if you look at families growing up in areas where there's high poverty, and areas where there's lots of crime, lots of drugs, substandard housing, all of the things that are working against families and working against kids. What I was always amazed at when I worked in Orchard Park in a housing project was not the kids who didn't make it, but the kids who made it. Mm-hmm. You know, how do you beat the odds? How do you fight against everything that's working against you and succeed? You know, and there are reasons why. Sometimes it's a strong mom, a strong grandmother, a father, a teacher, a police officer, someone in the kid's life that really it becomes kind of a mentor or a support for the young person. But let me give you another statistic, and then I'll try to link these things. We do a lot of work around the country with public agencies, public child welfare agencies. We did a study in Sacramento. We looked at all the 9 to 12-year-old kids in Sacramento. There were over 1,000 kids, 9 to 12, in Sacramento that were in the child protection, that were known to the Child Protection Agency, that had been reported to the Child Protection Agency because of abuse and neglect. There were about 130 kids, 9 to 12, who were known to the Juvenile Justice Agency, who were known to the Juvenile Justice Program. Here's the crossover. Half of the 130 kids, 9 to 12, who were known to the juvenile justice system came from the kids who were in the child protection program. Huge crossover, 50% crossover. We were talking earlier that DYS right here in Massachusetts has looked at their population. 60% of the kids at the Department of Youth Services here in Massachusetts have come from the foster care system, right? So here's the point. If we know that these are the kids coming into the foster care system by virtue of abuse or neglect, that there's a 50% chance that if we don't do a great job with the kids in the foster care system, there's a 50% chance they're going to end up in the juvenile justice system, right? And obviously, we need to do a better job of prevention with the kids and it's abuse and neglect, and tie it to poverty. We know that there's a 22 times ratio, okay? So what does all of this say to us? I think what it says to us is that we really need to do what Paul said. We need to focus. We need to look at where are the neighborhoods. Let me give you another number. It's a staggering number. In Illinois, there are 50,000 kids in foster care. Jess McDonald, who runs the department, will tell us that they've identified 16 neighborhoods in Chicago where half the kids come from. Half the kids who are in the child welfare system in Illinois come from 16 neighborhoods in Chicago. So what are we doing here? This is nuts. We know what the causes are. We know where the kids are coming from. And fortunately, you're doing some things in Boston, which I think are phenomenal. We need to be doing that across the country. Shea has been promoting that across the country. He talked about prevention. We talk about prevention all the time. The RFK Action Corps is heavy into prevention. We need to focus and target our efforts and our money in those neighborhoods, in those communities where the kids are at the highest risk. We know where they are, and I think we could begin to really bring the numbers down dramatically.
Well, this raises a question. Well, it raises many questions, but let me put one on the table, and that is, despite the sort of calm, rational explanations given on this panel, there is a certain shrillness to the public debate about what to do with these youth, and I think a certain fear on the part of many of the people who are involved in this debate. How do we get this message out? How do we change the tone and the tenor of public discourse on this issue?
I think one way, and I think we need more programs like the community policing program in Boston. We need more police chiefs, more local police officers, more judges, more people from law enforcement, more prosecutors, more state's attorneys, more people in the law enforcement end to be standing up and saying, look we don't want more cops. We don't want more money for jails. We don't want to lock more kids up. We want more money for prevention. And we want to focus and target our money. And I think people really do respect and listen to people in law enforcement. I think law enforcement folks carry a lot of weight in this country. And when they stand up and say, as Paul was saying, how it came from the bottom up. It was his officers that were saying, the kids need a job. We've got to get these kids jobs so that they will have something meaningful in their life. I think that means a whole lot more than a social worker standing up who's supposed to stand up and say, we should be spending more money on prevention.
Yeah, I agree with David. I think the debate has shifted already. And you have an organization of police chiefs talking about prevention. The organization Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, a group of police chiefs, prosecutors, victims, who are collectively adding their voice to the debate, talking about the need for more prevention funding, not abandoning the need for immediate public safety to be ensured, but also the need to invest in prevention. So I think that's already happened, and the debate has shifted. State legislatures have changed their laws over the past 5 or 6 years. That's a done deal. Now the question is, how do you ensure within those new laws that you maintain some sense of individualized justice for kids, that we don't sweep kids out into the criminal justice system without looking at individual case circumstances and individual children's backgrounds, and then look at what kind of treatment plans can be put into place, again, investing in programs that work not just for prevention, but also intervention. Just because a kid has entered the juvenile justice system doesn't mean they're lost. This is about a continuum. And the debate has shifted to the point where, as Paul indicated, prevention, intervention, and suppression. You need all of those things. And that's where we are in most communities in America today. That people are saying, wait a second, we tried transferring a lot more kids. What happened to them? And starting to see. Not many of them went to jail. A lot of criminal court judges are saying, what do you want me to do with these kids? A lot of the kids you're transferring are kids I don't need to incarcerate. Where are the treatment programs for them? So this is all added to the current mix of discussion about where we are and where we need to go. And it points, again, to the very balanced approach that needs to take hold, part of long-term strategic planning that needs to take place in communities, even in a place like Boston.
In the next 4 or 5, 6 years, we're going to see a 24% increase in young people who are probably right now in our elementary schools. They've been termed, unfortunately, names like super predators and what have you. We have to be doing things about those kids right now. I know one of the things that my department just was involved in is a major truancy initiative that the city announced. And that's underway. I believe very strongly that the biggest prevention tool that we can do in our city, or in any city, is making sure our kids get a good education. And I say very clearly that Tom Pazant will have a lot more to do with how safe our city streets are in the year 2006 than the police commissioner, any police commissioner will. And I think, we have to spend an awful lot of effort making sure that we educate our kids well. That's why I think you see Tom Menino is committed to those schools. And that's where we have to be right now. And I think that's what we have to say is, with all these young people coming of age, we better be prepared for that. We better educate our young people, or we're going to be right back to where we were just by sheer numbers in the late 80s and 90s unless we take care of these kids right now.
Julie, I think also, given that there's this underlying climate of anger, and it's especially predominant around schools, in that 73% of the fights that were reported to us occurred on or around school property. I think one thing that's really important also is to have more programs about conflict resolution. How do they handle this anger that's just waiting to explode when something does trigger it? And there are also like safe school initiatives. And other programs out in Oakland, they have almost like a safe house. So that this is a place that children can run to on their way to or from school if they get frightened or intimidated, that they know they can be safe.
I was just going to say, I think that you really have to separate out, and it's hard to, but, fights have been going on for a long time. I mean, the high school I went to, we had fights all the time. When kids gather, you have fights. I mean, that happens. But there's a difference between the kids who have fights and the kids who end up really doing very, very serious damage. We're conducting a study of a longitudinal study of kids in residential care, and we're looking at 3,000 kids in residential care across the country. It's a 5-year study. We're 3 years into the study, and we've got numbers on the first 1,000 kids. And the first 1,000 kids, these numbers are really tell a story. Over 30% of them were adjudicated delinquent, a third. A third of them have an incarcerated parent, 60% of them, about 26% were sexually abused, and 34% were physically abused as kids. So when you talk about anger, when you talk about kids who have anger, when you talk about kids who will act out and do some of the ridiculous things and serious things that we've seen kids do in this country, in communities where everybody throws up their hands and says, what's going on here? This can't happen in our community. You will generally find abuse somewhere in the picture. If you go back and look at these kids and look at their personal situations, you will generally find there have been studies of serial killers. Almost every single serial killer in the history of the United States has a history of physical or sexual abuse in his or her life. So the abuse issue is a critical issue that produces anger. Kids get angry when they have been physically or sexually abused. And they act out in ways that affect lots of other people. So again, it speaks to how good a job can we do with the kids that come to the RFK Action Center, how good a job can we do with kids that come to all of our other child welfare agencies, the kids in foster care, and then how good can we do with the kids at DYS that are in the JJ system, because I think Shea is absolutely right. We don't give up on kids just because they're under the jurisdiction of DYS. DYS is trying to get those kids back into the mainstream. We want those kids to succeed in life. But again, we really need to look at the linkages, and really, again, it's a question of focusing and investing.
And if you want to look at trends, and we think that the offending rates have gone up, look at the rates of abuse. And David, you know the figures better than I do, but I think from 80 to the present time, the rate of abuse and neglect, the numbers of abuse and neglected kids in this country is more than doubled. We haven't seen that in the offending category. So when you look at root causes and what we're doing to our kids and where they end up. And the other factor I'd add is the gun factor. When you look at the charts on juvenile homicides, if you took away the gun element, it's a flat line in most communities. The entire increase we've seen since the mid-'80s has been attributable to the presence of guns. You've got kids who don't have the conflict resolution skills, who are acting out a certain amount of rage, and then give them a gun to do that, you will have a lethal combination. So that access and carriage and then the decisions to use those guns is critical, and it starts very early, as David's indicated.
And one other factor, Julie, that I think is we need to put on the table for discussion is the drug factor. The drug factor is huge in our world. We see in jurisdictions across the United States, depending on the jurisdiction, anywhere between 40 and 80% of the kids coming into foster care have a drug problem somewhere in the picture. It's a mom, it's themselves, it's a boyfriend, it's a relative, it's someone in the picture that has a drug-related problem, and that is driving our system. And that, again, speaks to the need for drug treatment services. It speaks to the need to try to figure out how we can move people away from drugs and away from the use of drugs.
It's interesting talking about the use of drugs and alcohol, because the students reported that for the most recent fight within the past year, only 5% of the students said that it had to do with someone's use of illegal substances or alcohol, which is illegal for this age children, and only 3% involved an argument about them. But you're talking about a wider environment. That in terms of other family members, role models, etc.
Exactly.
I want to ask Paul to tell us about youth in Boston, but before he starts, after this, we're going to open it up to questions. And we have 2 microphones here. If you just line up behind the microphone, we'll alternate from microphone to microphone and ask you to briefly state your name and affiliation and to ask a question, a short question, rather than give an answer. Okay? Paul, Boston has worked very hard at getting guns out of the hands of youth.
Yeah, one of the real problems when I became the commissioner, you'd go out to a community and they'd say, you know, you people are real good at locking up young people carrying guns, but why don't you get the people that are supplying the guns to the young people? And one of the things that we did is, since 1991, we have traced every firearm that we have recovered in the city. And with the help of the U.S. Attorney, we made, I think, probably close to 10 trafficking cases where we actually go after the people who supply guns to the young people in the neighborhood. I think that sent a message. Some stiff sentences sent a message. And we also actually, again, it's about defining a problem. For years you heard Massachusetts pointing the finger and saying, you know, those southern states, they're all selling those weapons and they're all flooding into Massachusetts. When you actually define the problem, look at the problem, the guns we were recovering from young people under the age of 21, 34% of those were being purchased in Massachusetts. So our problem was right in our own city. One of the things we did was we went out with ATF agents and we inspected every federal firearm dealer in the city. And 80% of them immediately turned in their licenses. You know, we were going to make sure that the regulations were enforced and that any zoning controls we have were enforced. So, you know, we approached it from another. We also looked at, you know, what kind of weapons were the kids carrying. The weapon of choice for young people is a semi-automatic, better than 50% of them. But what happens with that is many of the kids, because of the latest technology with ballistics, we trace weapons. We can see if it was used in a crime. Now that there's an expression on the street, they want a weapon that's new in the box. And many of the weapons we recover, time to crime is less than 2 years, from the time they were purchased to the time they're used in a crime. We can trace them very readily and try to find out where the source is. And not only deal with the person who's carrying the weapon, but also go to the source of the weapon. And to a certain extent, you know, I think that's been successful, but I think the latest initiative that the Massachusetts legislature just really, I think, passed a comprehensive gun control bill, which I think is probably one of the best in the country. I think that certainly is going to go a long way to helping us in preventing gun violence, particularly the accidental things. I mean, we're doing a little bit better, I think, on identifying the kids that are carrying the guns. One of the things that we do now is when we have kids shooting at each other, in the old days it used to be, okay, flood the area with cops. And the kids believe they're acting anonymously. The cops don't know what's going on. Now, we bring all the kids in, and we can do that because they're usually on probation, parole, or subject to DYS, and we clearly tell them, we know what's going on. The violence stops, or we will enforce every conceivable law we can, and you will pay the consequences. And what we're about is we're about keeping you alive. And what's important when we do that is who's in the room? The U.S. Attorney, the AG, the DA, probation, parole, DYS, a number of police departments, clergy, street workers who are all there to say we'll help and get you resources, but we're all very clearly saying we know what's going on and it stops. So again, identifying focused intervention when there is violence, knowing who's doing it, getting on top of it, and stopping it is something that we've been using.
Okay, let's move to questions.
Thank you. My name is David Simpson. I'm a resident of Boston, no relation to Senator Simpson. I have a question. I live in Boston. I formerly lived in Manhattan. I also had the opportunity to live in Europe. Does anyone here, could you comment on the gun control over in Britain? My understanding is that they basically don't have guns in their society, and they have very few people, children, killed throughout the year due to gun violence. I have a solution, but could anybody comment on that first? Does anyone know?
Do we have any data?
To include the audience, could you comment on gun control in Britain?
Do we have anybody from Britain here?
To include the police force in Britain, whether or not they're allowed to have guns.
We have a British police officer on our faculty. He is unfortunately at his daughter's soccer game tonight and couldn't be here.
I think it's a proven fact that you go to places that don't allow guns, and their homicide rates are dramatically lower than ours are. So that's an absolute given. I mean, if we could get rid of guns, I mean, we'd be terrific. I mean, I think at some point we find 70 to 80% of our homicides are committed with firearms. So you you eliminate firearms, and you make my job a lot easier.
There are also some interesting studies going on, though, taking a look at what's happening in Japan right now. Because Japan had always been known as having extraordinarily low homicide rates and violent crime rates, and yet those rates have really gone up substantially in the last several years. And people are looking at why that's happening, particularly if it's not as much of a gun society as this one is. So there might be something learned from there as a middle ground somewhere between where we are and where Great Britain is.
Yeah, I guess we are more of a gun society, maybe more so in New Hampshire than in Massachusetts. A possible solution, it might be kind of drastic, but maybe you might want to comment on it. I live near Lexington, and there's an armory, a military armory in Lexington. And for all the gun-loving hunters in the town of Lexington, maybe they would agree to, if they go hunting in New Hampshire over the weekend, take their weapons to New Hampshire. When they come back with their deer or elk, whatever they kill down there, turn their weapons into the armory in Lexington and let a military or government person or a police person control that weapon during the week while me, myself, and everyone else from Lexington works in Boston for the whole week. If I have any protection problems, if I come across someone in Boston and I'm fearful of that person, he or she, what I can do is go to the commissioner, or I can go to the police officer that's standing behind me, and I can get assistance. I can get law enforcement assistance from the police officer, rather than me take it into my hands, take a gun into my hands.
Okay, does anybody want to?
Well, I think hopefully the new law that has been passed, one of the problems, you take it to your home, a lot of weapons are supposedly stolen out of homes, or children get a hold of them and they have the accident. One of the things the new law does, it requires weapons to be stored safely. Hopefully it also outlaws Saturday night specials, junk weapons, if you will. I mean, the law, I think, is comprehensive. It deals with some of the issues you talked about. I'm not so sure if putting it in an armory in Lexington, if you store it appropriately, lock it so it can't be stolen or used by a child, I think that would deal somewhat with the problem.
Thank you.
My question is, I guess, primarily to the police commissioner, but I'm a trauma surgeon, and when you talk about the intervention, particularly around the area of guns, I see people in the emergency rooms, in the operating rooms, particularly adolescents, and I think that's a critical time for intervention, because a lot of the youth that come in, that's when they're the most angry, especially if they don't have a critical injury that requires them to stay in the hospital overnight or whatever. They're ready to go right back out and retaliate. And I was wondering to what extent healthcare providers or making use of emergency room services or those other hospital-based services in collaboration with what the police are doing is being put in place for violence prevention and injury prevention.
We've done a few programs, child witness to violence programs. I'm not so certain that they specifically deal with the actual victims of a violent act. Obviously, we try to get them to cooperate and go into the criminal justice system. I mean, one of the programs that we've looked at is the Cops and Docs program, having police officers and physicians going into school and just explaining what happens when you get shot in certain places to young people in that. It's been successful in other communities. We've looked at it. But the child witness to violence, feeling it's a cycle of violence, trying to go in and deal with very young people who have witnessed violence, whether it's domestic violence or acts of violence. We're trying to train our officers to identify these very young kids and deal with them. And we're also looking at the Docs and Cops program.
Okay. If I can add to that, too, because I think this is something that just isn't peculiar to Boston. There are many communities right now that are looking at this issue of exposure to violence and what to do at the point of crisis, as well as more long-term provision of services for those children exposed to violence. And some of the common denominators there are community policing, because that is a first responder opportunity, as well as a hospital setting, and how to connect those people to mental health providers that can immediately or, again, long-term intervene with those children to interrupt that cycle of violence or the odds of immediate retaliation. And that is happening all over the country. And the good news in terms of that changing legislative environment I talked about was that Congress did authorize and appropriate $10 million for our office to fund around the country for specifically this issue, how to work with children who are exposed to violence. And that is something that we will move forward on this year.
But could I just follow, because it sounds like you're saying something in addition to this, which is that youth who have been involved in some of these situations who are not critically enough injured to have to stay in the hospital leave but are very angry. And it sounds like you're saying this is a point when someone could intervene, but is anybody looking? Is that a fair?
Right. And I'm actually from Oakland, California, and I know we do have several programs there. One program is Teens on Target, where we actually use other youth who have been victims of violence to communicate to these youth right at the point when they're in this volatile situation, and also while they're hospitalized because they are disassociated from the violent surroundings for the time being. And another program we utilize and we try to get other healthcare providers involved in is tattoo removal for kids who were formerly in gangs. Once they've made the decision to dissociate from the gang, we as providers will kind of help them in terms of using lasers to take off their tattoos, and they get mentoring and they do community service in exchange for this service.
Great program.
It does. And Paul, this sounds like what you were saying earlier. You need to reach out and cooperate and form networks with as many different organizations, professions, and people as possible, because it is a complex.
One of the things we try to do is when we have a problem, somebody gets shot like that, is who do we reach out to? In the old days, it used to be just this is a police problem. We'll reach out to clergy, street workers. Who can we get to go and talk to the young people and see if we can reach them and get them the resources they need, counseling, what have you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned one of the problems in our communities is that children and adults, I assume also, don't have many skills in conflict resolution. I wondered if you could comment on programs in place, programs you've seen that have been successful in cultivating that, and any other comments you have on that, conflict resolution in communities.
Well, there are programs going on. I'm not sure. Some of these are very new programs right now in conflict resolution. There are also more programs going on now to support mentoring, so that a lot of these young people feel that nobody cares about me. And it doesn't matter whether they're from an intact home or a one-parent or no-parent home. If there's some person, some adult who cares. So a mentor can both provide skills but also can provide the caring environment. And this would be a separate program in addition to the conflict resolution, or could be in conjunction with it.
If I can add to that, because there are school-based curriculum being used around the country right now. I think one of the more well-known ones is the Resolving Conflict Creatively program that started up in New York that's being replicated around the country. And some of the keys to that instruction is that it's not a one-shot deal. It's not like you have 9 sessions and then you're good to go for the rest of your life. It's predicated on the approach of utilizing it in elementary school and then going into middle school with a whole different set of issues you're dealing with, looking at the whole tolerance issue, as you're meeting different kinds of kids as you move out of your elementary school into middle school and on into high school, and to use a very interactive mode of training on conflict resolution. It's not this didactic instructional style, but getting the kids out there role-playing and working the issues. It is showing some initial indications of success in changing children's behavior, teachers reporting less aggressive behavior in the classroom, in the school setting. And what's most promising about this is the more creative curriculum don't stop in the school. They figure out adjunct parts of it that can go into the parents, back to the home, community centers. And the most creative ones are also incorporating this kind of curriculum in juvenile justice institutions. So when you looked at some of the things in jobs we mentioned before, you train kids in juvenile justice institutions with job skills, vocational skills. You get them a job, but you don't teach them the life skills or the conflict resolution skills. So they go on job, they get to the job site, they show for work, and then there's the first conflict, and they punch their boss out. It's not the way to keep a job. So there's a lot of training that needs to go on beyond that, and it's actually some of the stuff right now that our office is doing here in the city of Boston in partnership and working with Don Stern on working on job training and job placement through Boys and Girls Clubs.
This is very consistent with a study recently released by the Urban Institute in which they interviewed employers in the low-wage labor market who said what they were looking for most were these soft skills as opposed to the hard skills, knowing how to behave on the job and how to handle these situations. Yes?
Yes, my question is posed to the commissioner. I recently worked with Dr. Deborah Prothrow-Stiff, who's over to the Harvard School of Public Health and also has pioneered a lot of the efforts that are going on to reduce or to introduce youth violence prevention. And she has talked about, it's been over 15 years for her before the window of the 2-year period that was referred to by the president as the Boston model surfaced. And following her, she's talked about it being multi-level, it's being public-private partnerships, it's being community grassroots support, and not just, and I'm encouraged to hear you say it's not just community policing, because we seem to be getting a lot of the messages implicitly that it's just, let's just put more police out there. And make them the officer-friendly types, you know, that'll wave to you as you go to school, and that really does it. You know, it's good relationships with community. And I would like you to just talk some more about the notion of community partnerships and the massive network that was created in Boston, Roxbury, and North Dorchester with community-based organizations, with faith-based organizations, with Boston community school systems that really formed the infrastructure for decreasing the level of crime and violence that we're presently enjoying. Because I think people need to hear about this community partnership.
You're absolutely right. But in reality, I think that's what community policing is, a recognition that the community has to work together to establish a safe community. And I think that's what we've tried to do. What we've done in each of our 11 police districts is we've had what we call a strategic planning session where the police and the community came together and said, what kind of community do we want? And how do we together establish goals and objectives for that community? And in what role do we all have to play? What kind of partnerships? Who has to be at the table so that we can have the type of community? So right at the grassroots, we establish what kind of community, what are our roles, and as a result of that, we have really, I think, done a lot of partnering with faith-based communities, business communities, block watches, and I think that's been successful. But also, once we establish those goals and objectives, we use some Justice Department money to actually fund many of them youth-based organizations, Boys and Girls Clubs, Bird Street Gym, all of them saying, okay, here's our goals and objectives. We're all in this together, so we're going to give you some money so you can come in and help us, nonprofit groups, achieve our goals and objectives. Now, for the last 4 or 5 years, we've had a licensed clinical social worker who spends half of a morning in a police station and the other half of the day in a Boys and Girls Club. And what happens, we train our officers to identify high-risk kids, and the licensed clinical social worker's job is to get a network of services to help these kids, whether they be the 10-Point Coalition, the clergy, a community group, the local Boys and Girls Clubs, the YMCAs, whatever. There's a real realization of the secret is collaboration, everybody working together. I mean, you've hit on it, and I think sometimes when people talk about the Boston model, they like to take one piece and say it's this, and you miss it, because it's an array of partners come together who talk very, very seriously about prevention, intervention, and enforcement. And it's just, unfortunately, sometimes it's, well, they do this program. And then they'll come back and say, well, it failed. We didn't do that. It didn't work in our community. Well, you didn't get the gist of what we've done. We've really partnered with anybody that can bring something to the table in reality.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is John Bartlett. I'm a former staff member at Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, and now a first-year student here at Harvard Law School. We've heard a great deal tonight about children and youth as people to be contained, treated, perhaps feared. I was wondering if anyone on the panel would like to talk about ways in which youth can be involved, activated, and listen to things.
Yeah, there's a lot going on around the country. Many of our agencies involve young people in community service projects so that they get involved and give back to the community and can feel good about what they're doing to help the community. You know, I think when we look at kids and look at their strengths and try to play to their strengths. And we know that kids who do well in school, kids who participate in some kind of community activity, boys club, girls club, a Y, kids who have something spiritual in their life, kids who participate in a church or a synagogue or have something spiritual, kids who have good support in their own home, a good support system, kids who have those things going for them as strengths. Those kids are probably going to be okay, and those kids are probably going to do well. And how we ensure that kids have those strengths, I think, is really the challenge. Paul talked about that, the school department is going to determine what his job is going to be like in Boston and how well the Boston School Department does in keeping kids in school and educating kids in Boston. So clearly your point is well taken. I mean, I am a strength-based person all the way. I think that's the way we need to go, is to look at kids' strengths, play to their strengths, and try to build on them. And that's our best shot.
Are there ways to involve them in the process, to have youth on board in whatever it is you're working on?
We want to talk about the local level first, and I'll tell you what we're doing at the federal level.
Very quickly, we've got really police youth councils. United Methodist Urban Services, we started, again, a grant program where police and young people come together in their neighborhoods, identify what are the problems in there, set goals and objectives, how do we jointly solve those problems, almost like a youth council, and then they're going out and working with other kids.
We did a poll a couple of years ago through a project called Teens, Crime, and Community, where the Harris people surveyed and found in a cross-section across the country of youth, nearly 90% of the youth in this country are willing to volunteer time to benefit their communities, to benefit other youth, and indirectly to help reduce some of the crime that they've seen in their neighborhoods. We formed a national youth network, which consists of over 30 national organizations which sponsor youth. David's organization sponsors 2 youth on this network. The purpose of the network is to document what youth are doing around the country to help other youth, to help communities, to invest in their own communities with their time. A Youth in Action series now is being printed, where we are documenting different types of programs that youth can develop on their own, youth-led programs, not necessarily what we hear sometimes from youth where I have a seat at the table but no one really listens to me. Meaningful roles in adult functions, but also their own youth-led efforts where they can contribute to their communities. 40,000 documents for each one of those examples goes out across the country to youth organizations, affiliated and unaffiliated youth, who can get these things started in their own communities. So this is catching on, and we're listening to youth when they say they want to get involved and trying to provide them a meaningful opportunity to do that.
Yeah, we've just stumbled across this, how useful and beneficial in both directions. When we were doing focus groups in advance of writing the questionnaire for our survey, we had some focus groups of young adults come in and help us go over the questionnaires. And then we invited, as a result of their input, we revised the questionnaire. Then a few days later, we had another group come back with the same youth counselor escorting them. And when he sat down and saw the new questionnaire, he said, "You really listened to what we said." And I said, "Well, of course, that's why you were there." And he said, "We didn't really think you were going to pay attention to it." And I said, "Well, we really did, and we really meant it, and we're going to do it again. And please tell that first group about that." And the third group that we invited in for yet another round of feedback was a much larger group. And they were very enthusiastic and gave us some very good insight about, well, you're not asking about this, or this is really confusing. And so the questionnaire itself became better, and we learned about other areas that we should inquire about, because we did take advantage of their skills, and they were very useful to us, and they benefited as well as we did.
But was this sort of, we didn't know you were really listening to what we were saying? Okay, I guess we're over here now. Sorry.
My name is John Zeiler, and I'm a graduate of the mid-career program here last year. And my question is, what is the level of commitment of our institution, of Harvard University, to these issues, to the issues of youth in the inner city? There appear to me to be wonderful resources, but they're in disparate places. And is there, in fact, some ombudsman-like organization within the institution that is doing that kind of work?
There's Phillips Brooks House, which organizes a lot of programs for Harvard students who are involved in volunteer service in the community, and many of these projects are with individual youth. Here at the Kennedy School, through our Office of Public Service, we have a number of programs, tutoring at Graham and Park School and other schools in Cambridge. I don't know, maybe some students have a better idea of some of the programs.
My question was on a top-level policy basis where you're bringing together people from the Ed School, from Kennedy, from Public Health, to look at these issues. I mean, we are the most powerful university in the world. Are we
in terms of the research?
Yeah.
Well,
research on policy, are we fulfilling our obligation?
Whether
The Boston Gun Project, which is now being emulated, which basically where are the guns, who's carrying the guns, that type I talked a little bit of. That started here, and I think it's now David Kennedy has gone around the country. I know Frank Hartman from the Criminal Justice School was very instrumental in helping us identify people who would get strategic planning implementation grants. So as far as my department's concerned, when we've gone to Harvard, they've been very helpful in really, before police departments were driven by 911, now we're more into what's the data telling us? How do we define the problem instead of just chasing radio calls being about problem solving?
And I think there are Ron Ferguson's work with youth and the Youth Build program and the Harvard Project on Schooling and Children. So I think there's an increasing amount of work. Those of us who are researchers would argue that we could, of course, always do more research. And I think we can all argue that we could always do more. But I think it's moving in the right direction.
Julie?
Yeah.
You got
Oh, I'm sorry.
My name's Peter McEwen. I'm actually a graduate of the Kennedy School and currently at the School of Public Health. And I very much enjoyed the comments of the panel. And perhaps one of the areas that we haven't covered is the role of the media. And I'm not talking just in terms of video and films, but even the news these days seems to be becoming more violent. And I wonder what your thoughts are about desensitization and what role that has. And the second comment I should make is the last question, actually John Zeiler has started an interesting drama and role-playing program, pilot program at West Roxbury to allow the kids to help work through violence. So, you know, maybe there's this dual side of drama and role-playing, but I'd certainly like to hear the comments of the panel about films and TV and the violence and that, and are we becoming desensitized?
Yeah, this survey is part of a larger project called the Squash It campaign, which is done by the same group that brought Designated Driver from Scandinavia to the United States. And that was done, and we're now going to be doing it with youth violence prevention. That was done by working with Hollywood so that they would promote a new social norm. Nobody wants to be a drunk driver and kill people or maim people. And so they would just, in some TV programs, in films, whatever, and this is not just ads, these are actually in programming, would have somebody be offered a drink and they would say, no thanks, I'm driving. So we're trying to work also with us young adults, different shows where there are young adults, so they can say something like, squash it, man, walk away, and make it socially acceptable and the strong thing to do that.
Can I also comment on this? You've identified a really troubling issue.
Yeah.
When we took a look, and Fight Crime Invest in Kids, I think, did some of this too. When we took a look at the reporting rates of violence and how they had changed over the past 4 or 5 years, at the same time, in the last 2 or 3 years, that we've seen a decrease in actual juvenile violence, the reports on national news of juvenile violence had increased like 500 or 600%. So you talk about perceptions in the broader public about the nature of the problem, the scope of the problem, whether there's a sense of hopelessness out there about overcoming the problem. When you have that kind of disparate reporting on the issue, then you're behind the 8 ball. and then educating the public on what the problem really is about, which is less than 0.5% of juveniles 10 to 17 in this country get arrested for a violent crime in any given year. That will not be what a public audience would answer you if you asked them the question. They say 20, 30, 40%. But that's the bottom line number. So we started working with the media. The Attorney General has recently spoken to the Broadcasters Association of America about this issue at a national gathering to try to create a better balance and also at least a counter message about what the real numbers are and the real scope of the problem is. Same goes for the print media as well as the TV and radio media.
But you raise a very important point, which goes back to our earlier question of how do we influence the public discourse on this topic. The media is certainly an important voice in that. Yes?
Yeah, my name's Larry Hampton. I've been working at the Robert F. Kennedy School for 11 years. One thing I was just thinking over here about what's been happening for the last 11 years is the age difference between the parent and the child. I think what's the problem is basically there's no parenting skills. And I want to know if there's any statistics on that, the age difference, because I see it's a common thing for the last 11 years.
You mean more younger parents?
Yeah, younger parents, kids having kids, more say, the parenting. Because I see a difference between how I'm raising my kids and how when I'm in a meeting with another parent, a team meeting, it's just, they just don't have a clue about how to raise kids. And I can see it's a theme that's been happening for the last, since I've been involved with DYS. And then we're sending the kid right back into the home. And the same thing is, it's like a cycle.
And what are the ages of the kids that you're working with?
I say 14 to 21 if they're getting extended to 21. But that's what I was thinking about while I was sitting over here.
Unfortunately, kids don't come with instructions. So, and most parents parent the way they were parented. Most of us parent the way we were parented.
But is there any stats on that?
Go ahead.
I don't know about stats on parenting, but given the demographics...
I'm talking about the age difference.
The age difference, yes. Yeah. Given the demographics, the baby boom that occurred between 1945 and about 1960 meant that we had large numbers of young adults and a high percentage of the women who are of childbearing age were younger. And so we saw throughout the late 60s and the 70s, even though the teen birth rate may not have changed very much, a much higher percentage of the women who were of childbearing age were teenagers, and a much higher percentage of the children born were born to teenagers. And so we saw the effects of some of that in the 1980s and the 1990s, a much higher percentage of youth and older youth than in previous years were children whose mothers had started parenting when they were adolescents. And that sort of is a sort of macro demographic trend. How that relates specifically to parenting skills, I mean, we can all speculate, but I don't know of any real data on that. Do you?
No, I don't know of any data, but we are running a national positive parenting program where we're trying to reach as many parents as we can through daycare centers. And we have a very excellent Prudential the Prudential Foundation has put $1 million on the table to fund this, and we're trying to hit every major city in the country and try to train as many teachers in daycare centers, people working with foster parents, any kind of person who parents, so that they can learn great parenting skills and become a great parent. Because your point is really well taken. Parents are the most important people in kids' lives, and if we don't do a good job as parents, the kids are not going to turn out real well.
You raise another interesting point, because the teen birth rate now is about as low as we've seen it in quite some time, and the percentage of all people in the population who are teenagers is also low, which suggests that 15 to 20 years from now, we will have fewer youth out there who are the children of women who started bearing children in their teens, and it will be interesting to watch that.
Hi. My question focuses on the identity of the Boston police officer in the 1990s as we move on to the turn of the century. We hear a lot about community policing, and at the same time we've got more or less urban and some suburban youth who are fighting, killing, dealing It's a tough time to be a police officer. It's a tough time to be a young person growing up in a city like Boston. We've seen in the past few years negative press on cops, corrupt cops, cops beating up other cops and not confessing to it. How do we expect to train our police officers to work with often violent youth who regard police officers in Boston as a threat to their very existence and their identity? This clash here is something that I think is going to become more and more important, and the concept of community policing I think is vital to life in the inner city. And how are these police officers going to instigate a kind of trust with urban youth who look at them as the enemy?
Well, I think we've tried to deal with that in the last few years. I mean, we've dedicated a number of offices, a number of programs to try to deal with prevention, jobs, and alternatives. We can point to programs where offices are identifying high-risk young people, getting them summer employment, that type of thing. So I think that's a step in the right direction. But as I indicated earlier, a small disproportionate number of young people commit violence. We also have a small number of officers who cause problems. And we have to, and are doing a much better job of identifying those officers, putting them in what we call an early intervention system, which I don't think existed in the late 80s and early 90s. Now we identify them, we counsel them, and make sure that, in fact, that is not acceptable behavior. I think, again, community policing is built on trust, and that trust has to be there. And one of the things that we've seen is that as crime has gone down in Boston, the complaints against our officers, though we have 300 more, have also gone down. So, we've tried to do a better job of identifying our problem officers. We have a long way to go, certainly, because that trust factor is absolutely critically important to whether we continue to be able to deal with our young people.
We have time for the last two questions if they're quick. Okay?
Great. My name is Marshall Fordyce. I work with the Department of Social Medicine at the med school. We also support one of the community-based groups that's funded by the SPIG program, Strategic Planning and Implementation Grants, through the Boston Police. What I've heard tonight is that the group of people that were focused on in the late 80s and early 90s were a small percentage of the population of youth. The percentage that were poor, something that hasn't been mentioned is that they're black and Hispanic, that this group, it's kind of hard to define, as I've heard also, whether they're good kids or bad kids, whether they're carrying guns to protect themselves or carrying guns because they're gang affiliated. How do you draw the line? And one of the questions was who makes that decision? It seems to me that a large focus...
Quick, so we can...
Okay, yeah, sorry. It seems to me that a large focus of what interventions should happen is they should be community-based. Many programs can focus on different parts of the problem, but what is the Boston Police Department's plan in increasing that kind of support through the SPIG program or through more programs like that?
Well, again, it's focusing on the whole issue of prevention in getting the necessary resources. And again, we can't have enough partners. We've really tried to partner with an awful lot of nonprofits, work with probation officers, work with the clergy. So you're going to see that continue. We continue to focus on the education issue. So I think that's where we're going, creating more and more partnerships and realizing that we're not the solution. I mean, some of the good news we talk about is some of the grant money may run out. Recently we had, for instance, Channel 7 or the Anson Brothers picked up the cost of the licensed clinical social worker program. So we've got to convince people that, if we're going to be successful, we've got to keep these partnerships going with these nonprofits, and we've got to be about, somebody's got to pick up the cost someplace. And I think law enforcement has a unique ability right now to make that type of pitch, because we couldn't have made that in the late 80s and 90s when our cities were almost becoming unlivable. Now, with the crime rate in our city being, I think, at a 36-year low, we can go out and say, hey, look, if we want the success to continue, we've got to talk about jobs and alternatives. We have to talk about bringing in nonprofits and resources to identify high-risk kids and get them the necessary resources.
Hi, my name is James Michael Long. I started a company called Project Kids Incorporated, and I was raised in East Cambridge. Excuse me, I'm not used to talking on a microphone. First, I want to thank Commissioner Evans. I know Ralph Martin. I did the Gloves Not Guns program, and we had nothing but a great deal of support from Ralph Martin. I also have experience working within the Department of Youth Services, Colony Detention Center. Was raised in East Cambridge, like I said. It's a public housing projects over there called the Roosevelt Towers that was shut down in 1975. One thing I want to make, I guess my point is this, there's a policy now, it's called the One Strike You're Out policy. And we talk about preventative measures, and it's going to be a rough one if we can just take people and, I don't know, take them right out of their homes. It's kind of hard for me right now because I'm dealing with a couple of kids who are homeless under this policy. Let me just turn this way. My question is, I ask you to take a look at the policy and consider how it will affect not only the young people, but the society that we live in. They talk about a public safety issue, and that's within the housing development. I understand the term housing development and project. My question is to David over in the corner there. Is that your name, sir? You are from the projects, I understand?
No, I work in them.
Okay. I would ask you, are you aware of this policy, and do you feel that it is 100% correct?
No, so it's 100% incorrect. I think, as I understand it, most of the states that have implemented a one strike and you're out policy are not really enforcing it. They have found that it's, I think the only state that really continues to enforce it strongly is California.
I'd like to, can I just say this?
Yeah.
Here in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, there was a 6-year-old boy that was dismantled from his home. So it is happening in Massachusetts and right here in the city.
Really?
The 17-year-old son was, it's a civil charge also. It's not a criminal charge that's brought up. So the authority has a jurisdiction to pretty much do as they please.
Okay.
That's all I have to say.
Sorry to hear.
I'm sorry, ma'am. My question was also for that gentleman. What is your reaction on that? On the not the commissioner, but the gentleman right next to him.
I think I commented indirectly on these types of policies earlier when I talked about the need to make sure we individualize our treatment of people based upon their situations in the background. And so whenever you come up with a policy that has a mandatory exclusion in some fashion, it's ripe for some sort of injustice to take place.
Thank you.
And when I said two, I didn't see you up there, so one quick question from the second floor.
Thank you. My name is Alex Papali. I've done some community organizing for a few years. I would say that in the opinions of the vast majority of people that I work with, the redeeming qualities of police in general and the Justice Department and authorities, you know, who have the rights to take away other people's rights, you know, are few and far between. I mean, they're really, in all the examples of the dealings that these people have with the police, it's just abuse of power after abuse of power. I'm talking about, you know, the black cop who got beat up by the white cops in Boston. I'm talking about the 34 people who died in Massachusetts prisons last year, 7 by hanging, 1 by dehydration in a medical ward. You know, I'm talking about the abuse of power by the Brotherhood, you know, the Fraternal Order Police and the Justice Department, the Mumia Abu Jamal case, you know, and countless other cases in this country. You know, Abner Louima. I mean, all kinds of examples. And, you know, what reason is there for us to have any kind of trust in this authority, you know, who comes from outside the community, into the community, controls things, sells out, you know, can someone give me an excuse, please?
Well, I don't agree with, you know, I'm not going to argue one way or the other, but I don't agree with the whole concept of they come from outside the community into the community, because what has happened, at least in my city, is that they are part of the community and must remain part of the community and have a stake in the community and live in the community. So I think that certainly is going to change. And as organization is as big as we are, we're going to have problems, and how we deal with them will determine how good we are and whether or not the community should have faith in us. But given the nature of what we're about, the incredible powers that police have, there's going to be problems. But I think there has to be a commitment to deal with those problems, and I'd like to think that we do deal with them.
I'd like to thank the Robert F. Kennedy Children's Action Corps for providing the opportunity for this remarkable discussion, and our panelists, Shea, Bilchick, Paul Evans, Penny Green, and David Leaderman, and to you. Thank you.